You don't need to have as heightened awareness about this kind of in-between import-export compliance risk. You're responsible for your threshold of responsibility.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're on for a great show, a Simply Trade podcast, and I want to say thank you again. It's almost like a broken record, Lalo, that I keep saying this. I am just amazed when we start looking at the different numbers of people following us and subscribing and liking and commenting, and especially with our new YouTube channel, people are giving us more comments, which is great. But very humbled with the progress of the show or excuse me, if I'm in Canada, I'd say progress, right? And anyway, all of a sudden that I will say thank you to our listeners. It is just humbling. And Lalo and I, we thank you so much. But Lalo, I'll tell you, I'm just amazed on how things are going, and people are lining up to come on the show, which is great because we thought we'd have to really keep chasing people down, and it has been just again a humbling experience.
It has been, and the other good thing is that we're also getting people that are asking, "Hey, how can I advertise on your show?" So finally, yes. I just want to say, I mean, I don't. It's kind of a little. I'm not the kind of person that like goes out and just does a hard sell on anybody or anything. But I just want to say, we started this podcast as a let's get to talk to people during the pandemic because we couldn't meet people anymore in person. I mean, I don't know if you remember way back then, and conferences were sort of trying to roll back in, and whatever the case may be. But we were still not getting to see our colleagues in person, and so we said, well, let's do this podcast. And so it was more like a little fun thing that we did. It wasn't meant to like be a real business or anything. But unfortunately, all our listeners are making it a business for us. It's becoming a bit of a.
Isn't it something? I mean, I'll never forget our first public appearance. We go out and we're just like, hey, we're here to see, and try to introduce the show and whatnot. And there were people that were standing in front of our booth with the backdrop, and I happened to walk up behind them, and a couple young ladies were saying, hey, I listen to these guys. This is a lot of fun. I love the show and whatever. And I asked the question, well, what do you think? Is there some way we can, improve on the show? And they're like, oh, it's you, it's the voice or whatever. And same thing happened to you. When I walked up on another thing, you had a fan that was wanting to take a picture with you at a different conference. And it's like, man, I'm telling you, we didn't do it to try and stroke our egos here, folks. But this has been a great time, and we can go on. I don't want to keep, sounding boastful here, but thank you so much for. Apparently, we've hit a niche. You guys are liking it, and we will very soon be able to, I guess, announce a major sponsor for us. And we've got others that are knocking on the door. So we may have quite a few to announce or, more advertising, whatever. Hey, we got to pay the bills.
No, exactly. Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say it's getting more of a burden. We still want to keep this free, of course, so there's two ways we can keep it free is, subscribe, follow, recommend it to all your buddies or, anybody who's in trade. Please do that, because that actually, believe it or not, just by doing that, it actually really, really helps us rank and do, just get the stats up. Number one. Number two, we will be bringing in some advertisers, but more on that later. So anyway, but now let's get to the show for today's show. We have a repeat guest coming on our show.
Well, we've got a phenomenal lady that I'm going to tell you, this lady is going to forget more than I'm going to get to learn. So she's going to have to draw me some pictures on this next little topic, but I think it's going to be phenomenal in that, folks, as far as our listeners, this is one that you need to really listen to. We're going to hit a topic as far as enforcement type things and all that. You hear about import enforcement, you hear about export enforcement, and we're going to touch on some of that. But what about in between? What about some of the like domestic transactions? Are there any compliance related things that you should be doing with domestic transactions? What about routed transactions? What about getting into just transportation? You're thinking it's a simple deal. You may be in, as I had mentioned off camera here, you may be in Corinth, Mississippi, or Searcy, Arkansas, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, or wherever else, or even Cushing, Oklahoma. Let's say that's one of my stomping grounds. Some smaller town, it's big enough. You've got businesses going in there, and you're doing transactions. We have quite a few folks that have come into the country from all over the world right now. Well, if they're trying to buy goods and stuff like that, what do you do? Should you be vetting that kind of stuff, even if it's a domestic transaction? So with that, I guess you coming back around, we've got somebody, most folks know Beth Pride. She's been around for quite some time and is always a pleasure to deal with. Well, she's got some folks on her staff that just are unbelievable. And we have one of those fortunate to join us for a second time. Gabby Griffith, I appreciate you coming on with us. What is your official title? Are you a consultant, advisor, what? I'm sorry that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. First off, thanks for having me back. I'm a director at BPE Global, been here about 7 years, and you nailed it. We've got an incredible team, and Beth is, as you say, a legend in this industry. So I'm happy to be here representing BPE today, and thanks for having me back. I think I was one of your first back in the pandemic. I remember where I was, and you guys getting this off the ground. And like I said, watching you guys just grow this has been really cool, and props to making it a conversational topic and, making it cool and having a fan base. You guys, do you have merchandise yet? Get your hoodies and your caps.
We haven't gotten quite, we've had stickers. I don't know if we've gotten too much further.
Stickers, like the kinds that you put on your laptop or on your container, on your Yeti that you put stickers on there, so that, yeah, that's
nice. All right. Nice now. Yeah, well, thanks for having me back, guys. And Andy, I think this topic today is really interesting. I think it goes without saying that I don't need to explain to this audience that we live in a crazy, complex world of just period. And specifically when it comes to the rules and the enforcement, the four-letter word that no one likes to hear in any capacity. There are certainly expectations across the board on the United States specifically regarding imports and exports. And we're all very familiar with the specific regulations. If you're the importer of record, so on paper, responsible for bringing that across the border, or the exporter of record on paper, responsible for that. But there is this in-between space. And I always tell my clients, you can't ignore that in between space. The amount of times I've had or heard, well, we just do domestic transactions, or we don't export, and we're just in R&D, or we just sell to this company that all we do is get it to Miami. It's all good. Or, we never hire foreign nationals. So it's always in those moments where I'm like, well, let me tell you some stories. So yeah, I think that this is really certainly a great topic. There is baseline diligence. I think that, every company from small to huge should have in place. There's really no excuses for feigning ignorance on this topic. And I'm excited to dig in.
One of the things, I guess, let's set the stage here a little bit, is that, again, you've got, with the imports, you're bringing in a lot of goods and whatnot. So there's an import of record. There's an entry goes in. You got a customs broker usually involved, and all those kinds of things. Okay, fine. You've imported the goods. Now you're in the process of, or you may be manufacturing, goods domestically. Okay, fine. Again, you have raw goods that come in, whatever. If you're selling those goods internationally, then you've got exports. Well, you go through all those regulations. And again, you're looking at it, and most of the time with goods that are, if you're sourcing from different places around the world, or you're selling to different places around the world, in your process, you should be, or somewhere along the lines, I would have to think 99% of companies and people are probably vetting those parties to the transaction. They're on the bill of lading, on the commercial invoice, or different things like that. And I would have to almost say 100% of carriers are sending that stuff through that data through the government one way or the other, whether it's import or export. You got the manifest thing, so that's being looked at. But again, the scenario here is, what about a sale domestically, and you have 6 to 8 million illegal aliens that have come across now, whether you like them or not, or undocumented, whatever you want to call them, I don't care. The issue is we've got a large population now of people that have come into the country that are not U.S. citizens. They're coming from all over the world from, if last count, I think it was 120 different countries that come through the southern border. You have situations where a lot of those people are looking for jobs one way, either in the black market or gray market or whatever you want to call it, where they may be getting paid by cash or whatever. Okay. So you got a cleaning crew that's there now that may have some foreign nationals. You just said a company doesn't hire foreign nationals, but then your vendors might. You may have a maintenance person or construction person now that's all of a sudden in, and they're on site of a commercial build that may have something to do with a product that is highly regulated, whatever the case may be. I mean, you can come up with scenarios. I'm not trying to, just blow this out of proportion. What do you think, Gabby, that a person should be doing here, a company should be doing? I'm always, if in doubt, check it out kind of thing. You need to be looking around on things. But in course of business, how do you handle all this? It's almost overwhelming. Should you be vetting people or not?
I think that's a great question. I certainly don't think you're blowing it out of proportion. I think I've actually encountered every scenario you just described. So in terms of, I do want to come back to your question about how do you have that baseline diligence on sales, but I want to take a step backwards up the supply chain to talk about kind of a two-prong approach when it comes to domestic transactions, because there certainly is your domestic seller, vendor, supplier, whatever, the domestic sale, whether that's a tangible movement of goods. That's something you can touch. But as a domestic, you could be a domestic manufacturer, reseller, domestic entity. I see this a lot with domestic manufacturing. Coming back up your supply chain is understanding what your product is. And we're going to talk about food real quick. I'm going to take a pivot and we're going to talk about cake, because I always use this example and think about, okay, you're a domestic cake maker. Your cake that you make in the United States might be controlled for national security reasons. It might need a license to ship to Canada. It might need a license to physically ship to Japan. It might need a license to go to China. There's rules and regulations around that cake, perhaps. What a lot of companies might know that, they might not know that, they might not know that until they're at that point down the supply chain where they're making the sale. But what they don't understand a lot of times, specifically when I deal with domestic folks who just don't have this really in their circle of care, is that the recipe for that cake might be controlled. The recipe ingredients, where are you sourcing your flour from? Is it from that controlled region over in China? Then you might have some restrictions. So not only are your ingredients that you're bringing in, or if you're a reseller, if you're bringing in certain parts and components, but if you are just the recipe, the information for the development, the production of your cake might be controlled. And the reason I want to back it up that supply chain is because that's really where it starts with. And every company at baseline, regardless, should have an understanding of, what do I have here in my facility? Because if you can have that diligence in place and say, no, all I make is a literal cake, and that's not export controlled, then I don't need to really worry about certain checks and balances of hiring certain foreign nationals on my cleaning crew who might see my kitchen or who might have access to a technical specification printed on my wall. You don't need to have as heightened awareness about this kind of in-between import-export compliance risk. You're responsible for your threshold of responsibility kind of drops. But if your cake, now back to metaphorical, is more restricted, then you have to really start caring of, okay, are we screening everybody who enters this facility? Do we have just domestically these certain checks and balances in place? If this recipe needs a license, do we have a foreign national sitting here in San Francisco who might need a license just to work on that recipe? Because we see that all the time. I talk to CTOs. They're like, no, we don't export any of our products. And it's like, you got any foreign nationals on staff? Because they're accessing that super controlled recipe here in San Francisco. They need a license to do that because it's all about protecting that data. So only then can you go to the sale. And I'll stop talking now for the next step.
I was throwing out quite a few different scenarios, and let's back up here a little bit and talk about the actual widget. In this case, you were using the cake, and it makes sense. It's like, okay, well, I love how really, is it really going to be a license here? Well, take the cake and replace it with, a clock radio. Take that out and replace it with some type of special garment, for example, that may be used in police work or fire prevention or whatever the case may be. You don't know how that commodity may be used, and you may be looking at it again purely from a domestic transaction type thing. But if you've got a government contract, if you're doing anything with the Department of Defense, or anything or that supports it, maybe your vendor, maybe your client has a DoD contract. Well, again, that supply chain goes in there. And so that's the thing. And also, even with the way you're handling your data, is everything secured on it? I kind of go back to the scenario too of I use scenario a lot, don't I? As far as the movies you watch, and you see some type of espionage type activity that goes on, what do they usually do? Somebody is pretending to be or comes on as the janitor or somebody cleaning the office. And what are they doing? Then they're searching around to the people's offices. Now, if it's just an average Joe, they're not, they're going to do their job, go on. But if it's something that's vulnerable, when you wrap up at night, you've got your files on your desk for the next day. You know what you're going to be working on. Well, should they be on top of the desk? Or shouldn't they be locked up? Everything's should be locked up kind of thing. And those kinds of security things, people can look at it if they know what they're looking at. If you went into your competitor's factory, you know what to look for. So as you're walking through, that's how they're using this kind of machinery, or they're using this kind of chemicals, or whatever the case may be. That's why, when you're looking at somebody that, why should you make sure that only U.S. domestic folks are in certain situations by law and regulations, or authorized, and all that kind of stuff? That's why that comes into play, because we got people that are basically in today's world that they don't necessarily like us, and they'll use any means they can to damage us. Well, it may be some little company in the middle of nowhere kind of deal. So, all right. So, what do we do about this? How do doing the sale transactions? One thing, vetting people from vendors and all that. It's really two separate issues here. And folks, forgive me if you haven't heard. I keep coughing a little bit. I've cleaned and raked some leaves, and I inhaled a bunch of dust and stuff yesterday. So I'm feeling it today. So forgive me if I cough. But what's our next step, Gabby? I mean, what do you do about this?
Yeah, great question also. So again, back to this two-pronged, starting with really knowing what domestically, what are you dealing with, right? Because that's really going to dictate the next step. So step one is thinking about your processes, where in your process, if you are a domestic manufacturer, do you have a new product introduction process that you can do this vetting for? If you're a reseller, do you have a customer onboarding process? Likely you already have a document in place that you can add language to do some of this vetting of the knowing what you've got piece. And then you turn to the second piece, which is now you're in sale mode. So you are getting into that facility in Miami, you are making it available for pickup on your dock. Now, once you've gotten to sale mode, you know what you're dealing with. If you are selling something that's highly export controlled or not even just export controlled, you know that is going to require a license. You know kind of how to handle it down to the execution at that point. So again, it comes down, and your responsibilities at the time of sale. Now, there are certain expectations, regardless of whether you have a highly export controlled product or not. You cannot sell to entities. So that's people, businesses, banks, hotels. I mean, just lots of different combinations of entities on various lists that are sanctioned by our government, whether there's tools, and I'm sure you've had other speakers come on about screening. And to that point, I see all the time my domestic clients say, oh, well, we don't ship anything across a border. So we are domestic transaction. Well, guess what? There are lots of domestic entities on that list, and that doesn't absolve you from your responsibilities to screen. So there is an expectation from the government of know your product, know your customer. If you don't know your customer, which is entirely a realistic scenario for many businesses, have language in place that you have vetted, that you have your reseller or your buyer vet and say, I will not resell my company ABC's products to one of our sanctioned embargoed countries. So to answer your question in short, I think again about that two-step diligence process. One, what do I have? Two, how do I sell? And from there, it's like a choose your own ending book. It's just going to be very business company specific, where thinking about what do I have? Okay, how do I figure out what I have? Do I ask my suppliers to provide me with the harmonized tariff code as well as the export control commodity at the ECCN? Do I, on the sales side, do I put a statement into my NDA, what is currently in place on both the vetting what I have piece and the sale piece that I can insert language into? Because we don't want to be adding work. Everyone is so overloaded, but these are such critical things to think about that it's 100% necessary for companies, again, no matter the size of the company, to sit down and say, what do I have going on? Where can I leverage and put that control in place, that mitigating factor that I've done this diligence, and then on the sales side to do the same?
I will say, I mean, you're getting down into some the actual things to look at. Obviously, from your contract perspective, what clauses should be put in there. So that's getting, some of your legal team involved with a company and all. But even before that, just if I'm the owner of a company and I'm looking at it, with this area being that I'm just Joe Blow here in the middle of nowhere, trying to do what I can to provide jobs for the local economy and doing all that, I'm thinking I'm in good shape. Now I'm like, okay, I'm kind of getting scared here because this is overwhelming. I mean, this is all Greek to me. I don't deal with international. Would it be wise to basically come back and go, let me spend a few $100, have somebody come in, do a quick analysis. And if there are some red flags on that, they'll be able to point that kind of stuff out to say, do I need to do a few more things? Would that be a good approach to have somebody that would be somewhat of an expert to come in and take a look at things, just to test the waters a little bit to see, am I good or am I not or what?
Yeah. I mean, obviously I'm biased, so I would say yes, that is 100% worth having someone come on board. But in practice, I come from industry, and there are so many resources out there from a government perspective. I know Department of Commerce has their local offices for the Export Assistance Center has regional offices throughout the world. Where local small businesses can reach out to those offices as a starting point. And it's hard because the advice to small companies is, yes, you should know what you're having, reach out to experts, reach out to the government. But the reality is that they don't know what they don't know. So how is that awareness fed? And there's been, in the more macro sphere, a lot of enforcement on the Department of Commerce side in conjunction with OFAC. There's enforcement that is now being placed on expectations on banks. But again, if you're talking about a Michigan to Wisconsin sale of maybe an integrated circuit that is, being now produced in Ohio, that is usually, in my experience, companies either will have kind of a base awareness if they are buying product that is kind of in the export control space or selling it. But at minimum, it is, certainly worth contacting local. CBP has offices everywhere on the import side, just the local offices to say like, hey, what I have above board.
With that, let me just stop for a second, because we have a lot of listeners that may not necessarily know. You've heard of OFAC. It's the Office of Office of Foreign Asset Control, right? And with that it means, just like what Gabby's saying, when you sell your product, you manufacture it, you sell it, you put it out there, and it may be just fine domestically, but you want to make sure that when you're contract with your end customer, that they're not going to turn around and sell it to some nefarious person that's going out and sending it on to Iran or Russia or North Korea or wherever it is. I mean, as an example, there was as I understand it, and I don't know who the company was, but as it was reported, there were some drones being used that were manufactured in the U.S. or components thereof that the components were put into these drones, that the drones themselves were found in the Ukraine-Russian war, as well as I believe some other place in the Middle East. And it was U.S. components that were being utilized by the enemy. So it's, hey, if you're a company out there, do you want your product to be found on the battlefield in some place where a bad entity is using it? No. So that's what we're talking about. Excuse me. And with that, I guess one of the things that not only knowing your product, but what about your supplier and customer base? If I'm dealing with things domestically, though, should you, when you talked about screening or vetting or whatever the term you want to use, what should somebody be looking at just as to see if there's anything involved in that? Should they be screening their customer list and all?
Yes, absolutely. We always talk about this trifecta of know your product, know your customer, and know its end use and what it's going to be used for. So BIS, there is a great link, and I don't know if you drop links and whatnot in your show notes, but there is a great free link. To put the link to the consolidated screening list there. I think at minimum, there's obviously phenomenal service providers out there who offer solutions to embed systemically. But we always say, there's different thresholds of how to vet this. But certainly the screening and knowing your customer against these lists is paramount. And, I, like you guys, on these roadshows of our industry conferences, when I am interviewed, or I will often be in conjunction with an attorney, and we'll tee up questions, and we're always like, how mitigating is an end use statement, or how mitigating is having a record that you've screened? And the answer is usually you have no idea, because say you're Nike, right? And you see footage of Hamas or you see footage of Syrians wearing a Nike hoodie. And you're like, well, that is, how does Nike feel about that, right? And I won't speak for Nike, but it's one of those things like we see often visual footage of our enemies in American goods, driving American cars. And, it's how do things get there? And it's, you can only do so much diligence and doing kind of those first steps, having ironclad end use statements or language that, these goods will not be resold. These goods will not be, this recipe will not be shared with nationals of, sanctioned and restricted countries.
Well, all right. So let me stop for a second now. Let's talk to our service providers because you touched on that a little bit. If you're a service provider, whether you're doing imports or exports, or, you just happen to be a service provider and you're in a local community, obviously, and you're looking around. This may be something where you can offer some services. You don't want to gouge people at all. And keep in mind, this is an area where a lot of companies, they want to expand their markets, but they've never done international. There's a lot of ways that, the Department of Commerce has a lot of resources. If you're looking at wanting to export and trying to expand into new countries or new markets in other countries, that's great. But then you still need to go through. There's some things you need to look at when you're dealing with international. And in today's world, the international, if you will, economy, I'll put it that, global economy, winds up, there's a lot of, buy, sell, give, push, whatever. So in that is like, what do you do? And so walking through that process as a service provider, this is, if you're an owner, you need to be looking at who, all right, you've got my attention. I want to do something. Or if you're an employee that says, hey, boss, you need to listen to this show. Okay, I'm listening to, what do I need to do? Because I can't afford to spend a whole lot of money because I'm already, we're on fingernails trying to survive here. And now you're telling me I got to do something else in this. This may be a good opportunity for service providers to come alongside some folks, kind of help check them out. And then if there is a opportunity to help them expand, well, it may turn into a good sales lead. I don't know. That's one of those. But do you ever consult or advise, service providers to say, here's where you can offer your services you're already offering in a market that you've never tapped?
So you're asking if we would work with service providers to just kind of teach them how to tailor or expand their services?
Just, you work with service providers from the standpoint to say, how can you, to encourage somebody to start going down this road? I mean, I am a big proponent. Yes, you could do a lot of these things on your own. You just mentioned that, and you can walk through it. But it's like, in my case, I will say that I doubt if I will ever do my own taxes again, even with the software out there. Now I think they're all fine, well and good, okay? But I have done my own taxes, and I don't have a complex portfolio, so don't think I'm some guru here. But I have had an accountant do mine, and then I've done it myself. And then in 2 years in a row, I went ahead and got the software, did my own taxes, went through it, and then I turned it over to an accountant just to see. And without fail, the accountant not only came back with a more accurate return and actually got a better refund for me in one case, and then said, no, you actually can't deduct this. And, but they knew they had that expertise. I had the assurance that even if something were to happen, I've got somebody I can call on, rather than even with all the questions, they walk you through it and everything else. And I'm like, yeah, you can do this on your own, but get you an expert. Man, I'll tell you, it will save so much time and effort, and it's worth every penny.
Oh, yeah, 100%. So, yes, we work as a company closely with a few brokers and freight forwarders out there, just in terms of reviewing their process, their SOPs that they put in place with their respective customers. Here's a questionnaire, how you onboard new customers. So absolutely, I think that there are so many I think that, and I've heard because there's been a lot of press coming out of Department of Commerce in the past few weeks that going back to what I said at the beginning here, like we live in such a crazy complex world, and specifically as it comes down to import and export sanction regulations, companies need to invest in this compliance. It's super important. And, if you're a company who can't afford it, I mean, companies can find the money for certain things. And, compliance, I think, has historically been pushed to the back burner, not given the funding it deserves. But I will say that from obviously the clients that I have, that has been understood. A lot of the clients I have are due to, errors, mistakes that they've made. Oh, this went to not a good person. Now we're in disclosure. Now we should have, invested that money. But so it is, from a company standpoint, it is important to invest. From a service provider standpoint, it's important to invest. I think that specifically in the brokers and forwarders world, I think they get written off when it comes to their knowledge of compliance and their importance in the supply chain. I think folks in shipping and operations have traditionally been shafted and, just, that's that person down in shipping. And that role is so critical and so important. And the freight forwarders role is so critical and important. And there are a lot of checks and balances that a service provider can get in place so that they can in turn service their customers, the importer, exporters, the folks who live in the in-between of that, those domestic transactions. They need that training because they're also another layer in our ability to protect and to make sure that we're compliant.
All right, so let's go in because we're going to need to, we can keep going in almost like one rabbit hole after another on this kind of stuff. With this, I would say, what would be, just to look at it, I'm a business owner or an employee that's trying to get my boss to look at this and go, all right, we need to do this. What would be the 3 next steps somebody should look at to investigate going through this? We've talked, obviously, you got the screening, the legal contracts, you've got knowing your product, who who are you selling it to or who you're getting it from and all that. All this is so I'm not used to all this stuff. What should I do now? And go, okay, you've convinced me. I'm going to do this. Hopefully it's not going to cost me a fortune. What do I need to do?
Well, you kind of summed it up there, but I would start number 1, make a list. Make a list of a product matrix. We always start, when we're coming on to a new client, roll up your sleeves. What do you got going on here? What are you selling? Put it in a list. What are you working on? Have what's bought, what's built. If you just start by wrapping your arms around what you got going on, because everything really stems from there. And you, from an importer standpoint, because we didn't talk about the import considerations, but starting with the what do we have, and figuring out, you can go to competitors' websites. A lot of classification codes are publicly available, or some competitors might have it available. Try to poke around, figure it out, but identify what you are, if you are building, if you're working on that recipe, get it in that matrix, figure out if it's export controlled. That comes down to software also. If you are sourcing internationally, get those codes. So get a matrix going that has your products and flesh out what the HTS or the harmonized schedule number, as well as the ECCN is. Number 2, screen your customer list. As you said, know your customers, and have an ongoing process is what I will add about that. If you're not going to be hooked into one of those systems that does it for you, which the majority of small to medium businesses are not, have a process in place. And what that looks like, again, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Screen it on an ongoing basis. There's some good service providers out there that are affordable that you can do quarterly screenings and just have that diligence again in place that, so again, number one, make a list, make your product classification matrix. Number two, know your customers, screen your lists. And number three, put some end use language into your sales contracts, whether it is, what is this for? Where's it going? No, you will not resell this to the sanctioned countries. So review what your documentation is and figure out where you can embed some of that control language to really make sure you're rounding out the expectations.
Say then taking a fourth item is screen, not only your employees but also your vendors and their folks if they're having access on site, just to again double check.
Yep, absolutely.
Listen, y'all are such a phenomenal group of folks with BPE Global, and we will have links to our in our show notes to Gabby and the other folks there. But it's like you have such a diverse expertise, if you will, in industries, aerospace to manufacturing, the different things. I mean, it's the wealth of knowledge in y'all's organization is phenomenal. So of course, Beth is she's such a pleasure to be around. It's like she and I, whenever we get around, we always wind up, we'll get on a topic and she and I will debate an issue and whatnot. And I try and hold my ground with her, but eventually, I have to acquiesce because she's smarter than I am.
Oh, yeah. She's great.
Well, Gabby, thank you so much. Appreciate it. The one thing I was going to ask Lalo, from the Global Training Center perspective, are there anything things that come to mind regarding trying to help people become proficient? That's another thing is like your frontline folks. What should they be looking for and those kinds of things? Do you have anything as far as responsibilities on maybe it's importing or exporting or something that would relate to what we've talked about today?
Yeah, we do. And it all depends on who the client is, just almost like what Gabby said, it just depends on what you're looking at doing and what you are doing existingly, in your company. If you're if you're manufacturing products from imported goods that maybe you didn't import it, maybe you're just buying it from a domestic importer, that you think it's a domestic. So, I mean, maybe importing might work. Same thing on the other side of the coin, for the exporting. You're thinking you're selling, because I mean, there was a few points that you all made earlier on, you don't know who you're selling to. I mean, there's been a lot of cases where somebody sold product to, although sometimes they know very well who they're selling to, but I mean, some of them may not even realize who they're selling it to, and it ends up in Russia, or in a sanctioned country. And so we do have exporting classes where they educate you. Just because you sold it, you don't wash your hands off of it. You know what I mean? There's the re-export, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, so we do. We just invite our audience and or anybody who's interested to either reach out to us, and we can always get Renee, who's our in-house subject matter expert, our SME, to just have a chat and talk about what you need. And if there's not a pre-canned per se, training course that we have, we always customize. In fact, we do a lot of customization, so we'll just cater it to anybody's needs. So we may even reach out to people like BPE Global on occasion and maybe ask them, hey, do you think you might want to take on this project? And if it involves consulting and training or something, we may be able to partner with people like that to do something. So, but anyway, just reach out and we'll always find a way to educate and or help in some way or another. So.
Well, Gabby, thank you again so much. Lalo, I hope you have a great day with this. And folks, we're going to turn the show back, or end the show, should I say, and turn your day and give it back to you. And thank you for listening. And again, have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.